Yes, sorry for the delay, but I think it's important that we can understand each other. Again, so good afternoon, and thank you for being here with us. I'm Damian Cardona from the Department of Public Information. As you can see if you walk in the corridors of the UN, more than 1,000 indigenous representatives from all corners of the world are coming together this week and next for the 16th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The opening just took place in the General Assembly Hall a little time ago. The focus this year, of course, is the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted in 2007. Three prominent indigenous representatives are here to discuss concrete achievements and remaining challenges in realizing the rights of indigenous people, and speak about what changes they have seen in their countries and in their communities. We have, from left to right, Chief Wilton Littlechild is a Cree chief and lawyer. He's founding member of the Indigenous Initiative for Peace and a former member of Parliament. He also served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and as Vice President of the Indigenous Parliament of the Americas. Welcome, Chief. Then next we have Leticia Teleguario Sincal, Minister of Labor and Social Welfare of Guatemala. She is Maya Caquichquel and has been a strong advocate for empowering women, youth, and indigenous people. Bienvenida, Ministra. And last, to my immediate left, we have Mariam Aboubakrine, the current chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She's a medical doctor from Timbuktu in Mali, and she's a member of Tinghinan, a women's association focused on indigenous peoples in Africa, in particular the Tuareg. Bienvenue, Madame. So I think we're going to start by some welcoming introductions from our three speakers, and then we'll give the floor to all of you. So maybe, Chief, you're going to start?
Sure. Thank you very much. I bring you greetings in my language to honor this very special day. I thought just briefly I would reflect on my own journey in the work of the UN Declaration. As you would know, I think in 1923, Chief Descahe, and later in 1925, a spiritual leader of the Maori, Ratana, tried to go to the League of Nations in Geneva, but could not get in, were not received for an audience where they could present the concerns of indigenous peoples in their territories. So from 1923 until 1948, we had no voice at all in the international arena. And 1948 stands out because that's when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted. And even then, we were missing. We were not represented in 1948. So it was not till 1977 when the first delegation in the modern era went to Geneva. I was in that delegation. So for me, this is approaching 40 years of work on the UN Declaration. So you can imagine how tremendously happy I feel about reaching a milestone such as a decade on the UN Declaration. So throughout this journey, I thought I would highlight actually what were contributions. What were the indigenous people's contributions to the world? Because in our quest for recognition and respect or justice, in our quest to have our treaties honored and respected, we actually contributed a lot, I think, into the UN family and also to humankind. Let me just quickly talk to you about 4 of those. I've recently spoke about the 10 highlights, I think, that we have accomplished in the journey. So first of all, of course, the adoption of the UN Declaration was a very significant accomplishment. But through that adoption, you will note that our spiritual leaders, our elders, contributed to a unique recognition of a new right. The UN is used to recognizing economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights. But it was not until Indigenous leaders became involved in the UN work that spiritual rights came to be recognized. It was because of our elders asking if we could open a meeting with a prayer. And I remember I was tasked to go and ask the chairperson, and I was told quite bluntly, Mr. Littlechild, you know we don't pray at the United Nations. I said, well, it's not really a prayer, it's a thanksgiving. We want our elders to come and sing a song of thanksgiving. So she said, you have 3 minutes. And while the elders were singing, she poked me and said, Mr. Littlechild, it's 7 minutes. How long are they going to take? I said, I don't know. But you know, ever since then, ever since that day, every meeting of the UN, especially of Indigenous peoples, opens with a prayer. I think spiritual rights also being recognized officially at the UN through international law is also a contribution that was made. Our elders and the traditional knowledge that they have of taking care of Mother Earth and that they shared with the international family. It was on a day that one of our elders asked the UN and challenged them, who among you is going to argue for my brother, the fish? My brother, the bird that flies? Who among you is going to argue for the four-leggeds that die so that we can live? Who among you is going to argue for clean air and clean water? And it was on that day, really, the UN consciousness about environmental protection also started. We're used to recognizing women's rights, men's rights, elders, persons with disabilities, but no one really looked at the family as an important unit. And it was Indigenous peoples who brought to the floor the recognition, the need to recognize family, the need to recognize Indigenous law. So I think that throughout this journey that we have walked together, our people, where I started in 1977, was because of treaty violations among our people. So it's really encouraging then for me to see, for example, Article 37 in the UN Declaration that calls for honoring and respect of treaties. Because treaties are an existing relationship that include all of us. And I think to recognize that treaties and the UN Declaration are actually solutions for the survival and dignity of Indigenous peoples. They're not problems as they've been often mischaracterized, but they're actually solutions. And to see now a 10-year review, a pause where we can look back at 10 years of accomplishment, I think that's really significant. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you very much, Chief. You should have told me. We could have started with Thanksgiving, also the press conference. Ministra, por favor, tiene la palabra.
Special greetings from the Indigenous peoples in my country, in Guatemala. Members of the speakers, the public that hears us through the different channels of communication, it is my honor to be able to participate and be here with you. I would like to start my presentation by congratulating the new chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, whom I have known now for 2 years, and I know how she has fought in pursuit of a better world. I also would like to extend a congratulation and a gratitude for our participation in the name of the president of my country, Jimmy Morales Cabrera, and of course from the Maya, Carifuna, Xinkas peoples in Guatemala. I want to give my greeting, my warmest greeting in honor of the 16th session of the forum, success in the benefit of the peoples in the protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples as it pertains to the environment, education, culture, social and economic, health, and human rights. As we know, this session is carried forward within the framework of the 10th anniversary of the declaration, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Issues and the adopted measures adopted in September of 2007. Hence, I would like to congratulate and to extend my gratitude for the contribution of the indigenous peoples of the world for having promoted and achieved advocacy which allowed the adoption of this declaration. Also, after a fight of over 20 years, the declaration, without a doubt, is a contribution and an important advancement which gathers the aspirations of the indigenous peoples. And the challenge is now in the hands of the state. The state to promote acknowledgement of practices, principles, and values of centuries as a universal value and right. It is important to carry out efforts in order to achieve embracing these principles and include them in the declaration. Political commitment, especially by the decision makers and governments, and consistency in respecting, in the organizations respecting and safeguarding the rights, cooperation, international cooperation, and of course the tenacity of the peoples in not giving up in their fight. Guatemala, as history will show, has been a promoting country of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My participation here is evidence of such. It has also marked important advancements. My country has an important legislation or law which recognizes fundamental rights of the indigenous peoples, which surfaces out of the Republic's political constitution, the law of national languages, the peace agreements, which covers and guides the process of compliance and recognizes peace agreements, amongst them the agreement about the identity and rights of the indigenous peoples. Also, agreements and treaties that are recognized and ratified by the state of Guatemala, such as ILO Agreement 167 and the Declaration of the UN on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At a global level, there are several advances that the peoples have achieved. For instance, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that took place in 2014. Now, facing the enforcement of the Sustainable Development Goals, we, the indigenous peoples, in this instrument have deposited the hope for a better world, a more prosperous world, more inclusive and more comprehensive participation through the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We are also hopeful that international indigenous peoples, in this celebration of the 10th year of the Declaration, that we can observe more social advances. Once again, indigenous peoples, having adopted the Declaration, has reinstated the fight of the peoples. Therein, the forum faces a great challenge to promote and especially intensify these advances so that us, the peoples, can reach such development, and we are all called to contribute. All of us, I shall say, we're all called to contribute to that goal, especially governments, to build and implement public policy, including the inclusion of indigenous peoples, in which a strategic alliance between public strategics, private, indigenous peoples, international, global communities, and in this case, the UN, and civil society in general is key in order to achieve through the 2030 Agenda a sustainable development that is inclusive and sustainable. For us, it is an opportunity that year after year the UN carry forth the session, the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. However, the challenge continues to be major, and whatever solutions, concrete solutions, can surface from this, from the system of the UN, will be fundamental. Therein, our commitment to participate, to advocate in different processes that are important for the indigenous peoples in the world continues to be ratified. And again, the challenge is not easy, but together, and if every one of us can contribute a grain of salt, then we hope that in 10 years, we might have more quantifiable and measurable results in pursuit of a society that still lacks the voice. Thank you.
Now we're going to finish the round listening to the chair of the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, Madame Aboubakrine, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and who give special attention to indigenous peoples, for being here in this permanent forum of the UN for Indigenous Issues. Let me greet, first of all, these two people who play an important role in the adoption of the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My mentor and one of the people who inspires me so much in this struggle, Chief Wilton Littlechild. And I would also like to greet Minister of Labor and Social Welfare from Guatemala, who works a lot in her country, and who also worked for the adoption of the UN Declaration Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Due that it is the first day of the forum, I would like to highlight the most important points of this year's forum. As you know, this 16th session is focused on the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Tomorrow, we will have a high-level meeting in order to commemorate the 10th anniversary, and is organized by the President of the 71st President of the General Assembly. After reviewing our work, we implemented a new system, which are the dialogues. We have 3 different dialogues over the 2 coming weeks. A dialogue with indigenous peoples, and a dialogue with the UN organizations, and a 3rd one with the member states. Another important point throughout the 16th session will be the discussions with the special rapporteur on the main topics of the advocacy of human rights. We also have a discussion on the follow-up of the outcome document on the World Conference of the UN on the indigenous peoples in 2014. This was a big conference organized at the General Assembly of the UN. Two other important points that we will touch upon in this meeting and that are very important is the empowering of indigenous women and the empowering of the indigenous youth. This is also on the agenda of this session, and these are very recurrent topics because of the importance of the place of women and youth and for the development of those communities. So those are the main elements that we will touch on this week. We also have the 2030 agenda, and as you know, the 2030 agenda is the global priority, and for us indigenous peoples, we also see it with another perspective and to implement better the declaration. So those are the main topics that will feed the debate over these 2 coming weeks. And now to come to the main question of the journalist on what has been done in our region to implement the declaration. As you know, for us the declaration is a great tool at a national and international level that help us evaluate the application of the rights of indigenous peoples. So this is the legal document that we use. In Congo-Brazzaville, Law number 5, 2011 on the promotion of indigenous peoples was adopted, and it was the first time in Africa that such a law is adopted in favor of indigenous peoples. So we really have to recognize this. And it comes right out of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Also, in Central Republic of Africa, there was a convention of the Convention 169 that was signed in 2010. In Kenya, we recognized the new constitution for the rights of marginalized indigenous peoples, and that is how we still define indigenous peoples. They still marginalize them, they put them in a group, and they're not recognized yet. I would like to highlight that in Morocco, there was an official recognition of the language and culture of Amazigh in 2011. I must say that in this realm, there was the opening of an institute for the culture in which the indigenous peoples could show their work. Another achievement of the declaration in Africa is in Chad, with the creation of an institution that provides education and health to children. In this country, indigenous peoples are pastoral and are nomads. So these are some examples of achievements that we have seen in the African continent, thanks to the implementation of the declaration. I would like to conclude this first part in recognizing the opportunity we have here with advocates such as the Honorable Wilton Littlechild, people like him who have advocated so much so that on September 13th, 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted. It has been 10 years, but as he mentioned, there have been several tens of years to achieve this outcome document. So thank you very much.
Merci, Madame Aboubakrine, et bon courage à la tête.
Thank you, Madame Aboubakrine, and congratulations on chair.
By yourself, so our guest, no. You can use your micro, so translation can be.
Melissa Kent, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, Radio-Canada, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you very much for coming today to speak to us. As a Canadian, I have 2 questions, but my first question goes to Chief Littlechild. Last year at this time, we spoke because Canada finally removed its permanent objector status to UNDRIP. There was even a standing ovation here at the United Nations. So I'd like to ask you, 1 year on, can you tell us what concrete steps have been taken to implement UNDRIP or to harmonize it with Canadian laws, and whether you have any concerns about the speed of the implementation?
Yes, thank you very much. As I said, I've been coming for almost 40 years, and I think I probably have seen, well, less than 5 standing ovations at the United Nations. And last year was the first for me that was really significant. I think all of you will recall that when the United Nations adopted the declaration in 2007, Canada voted against it, and then subsequently changed their mind in 2010 with qualifications. And last year, Canada here took the floor to a very resounding recognition, I think, of thanks from the world in terms of their statement that they now have endorsed the UN Declaration fully, in fact, without qualifications. That was very significant for us as Indigenous peoples who had been working with Canada over the years at the UN and here in New York together on the declaration. So as we sit here a year later, there are a couple of very significant events that have occurred in Canada to add on to the announcement last year. One was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report that calls to action Canada in 94 areas, and 16 of them actually are on the UN Declaration. But also recently the Prime Minister appointed a committee of ministers, 6 ministers, chaired by the Minister of Justice, Indigenous Member of Parliament, Jody Wilson-Raybould, with the task of reviewing Canadian laws and policies in terms of how they comply with the UN Declaration. So there has been a couple of very, 3 or 4 very significant steps in Canada. But what is missing, in my view, is an implementation mechanism. For example, no one is monitoring the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. No one is monitoring the implementation of the UN Declaration across Canada. So we need a mechanism. We need a mechanism because the states were called to establish national action plans at the World Conference outcome document. And we have yet to see that in Canada. And I think it would be a very important and significant step going forward that we have this opportunity, as the treaty calls on us, as the UN Declaration calls on us, to work together. And hopefully when we go home from here now, we'll be able to see that development in Canada.
Can I ask one follow-up question? When we speak about the duty to consult on issues having to do with resources, land, is the understanding from your perspective, First Nations perspective, that would involve a veto right if there was disagreement over what to do with lands?
I think, unfortunately, that's one of the mischaracterizations of free, prior, and informed consent. Free, prior, and informed consent to us who are from a treaty territory is actually a call on us to work together. Free, prior, and informed consent actually was included in our treaty, for example. Our treaty dates back to 1876, and already there's a provision in the treaty for consent, not just to be consulted, but to be consulted with the purpose of seeking to obtain our consent. So some have said it's a veto. We don't see it that way. We see it as a call on us to work together. And I think that's really the proper way to characterize free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you very much. I'm Waldo from Latin American news agency Prensa Latina. I have 2 questions. My first question, 10 years after the UN Declaration, what has been achieved and what hasn't? And my second question on the Agenda 2030, do you feel part of this process? Do you think that your priorities are taken into account in the implementation process? Thank you.
Well, if I may take that question, when I look back over the 10 years, there has been significant achievement in a number of areas. For example, at the Permanent Forum, at the very first session, we mainstreamed women's rights. In the second session, we mainstreamed children's rights. And recently, sadly, sometimes late, but at least now they're being recognized, persons with disabilities. So those are significant accomplishments, I think, in terms of the Permanent Forum's work to mainstream those segments of our people that had been marginalized before. There's so many, actually, the recognition of us. You know, it took us 8 years to be recognized as human beings in Geneva. And it was over one letter, whether the letter S should be included in the word people. And it was significant because the international covenants that most or all states have ratified, the first covenant of each of the civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, indicates that all peoples have a right to self-determination. It doesn't say all peoples except indigenous peoples. But nevertheless, Article 3 of the UN Declaration was an important recognition of that right, that indigenous peoples have a right to self-determination just like everyone else, and that the Declaration now offers us an opportunity to benefit and share the human rights just like other human beings as equal. Well, human being equal as human beings. So I think in retrospect, there has been a lot, in my view anyway, accomplished from where we started. When we couldn't even get into the room in Geneva to hold a meeting, now we have 4 mechanisms here at the United Nations. I think that's a significant progress. We have, of course, the permanent forum, the expert mechanism, part of the Human Rights Council. We have special rapporteur. We have a voluntary fund as a mechanism. So coming from no voice to 4 mechanisms at the UN, I think is a significant progress.
I would like to expand and provide more information as to the points that have been mentioned. It is true that it is thanks to the efforts of persons that are with me today, there have been significant advances at an international level, particularly in terms of participation and the volume of participants, both government and civil society in this forum, where we gather year after year. This is also a parallel process. Also, the declaration that was adopted 10 years ago, other member states from the UN have made significant advances in its participation, specifically in terms of women and youth in several spaces for decision making. It's important to also mention that pursuant to the issues that are given priority in the declaration, we have specific focus on education, which has been one of the Guatemala's special priorities in trying to strengthen not just the quality of education, but also the strengthening of even a budget to the focus of national policy of each government in terms of rescuing or reigniting the indigenous languages has been fundamental alongside this, especially with a government in Latin America. We see that the topic of indigenous peoples is adopted comprehensively. This also parts from the efforts that have resulted in this forum. In terms of Guatemala, we can also state that we have a group of indigenous peoples that is headed by the government. And this has to do with the system of the UN through its different instruments has generated and brought forth. So we have major challenges. How do we present alliances? How can we strengthen, for example, the 2030 Agenda or SDGs with the political with the policies of each country that is present here is part of the work ahead. I can also mention then that one of the significant challenges is that the recommendations that usually result from the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues must be headed and appropriate and within the system of the UN so that it can echo throughout our countries. I believe that it is also an essential part to have other sectors and actors, stakeholders, engage themselves so that we as indigenous peoples can be strengthening issues that are very intricate as to ourselves. This agenda has to be prioritized and approach from different sectors and stakeholders. So whatever recommendations result from this session, it's something that has to have a pertinent, timely, and to a certain extent, as was mentioned before, through a mechanism that will allow us to have continuous review with the contribution that is generated day by day, and I believe that that is part of the continuous challenge.
I would just like to add something quickly, a few points on this. I must say that in Latin America, the commitment of the indigenous peoples plays a very important role in the realization and implementation of the rights that are protected under the Declaration. I would also like to highlight that the proportion of indigenous peoples in Latin America is also a favorable, a positive factor for implementing the UN Declaration, specifically to that continent. Another positive element in the implementation of the UN Declaration in Latin America is the opening of the states in this indigenous peoples' issues. So we have the example of Guatemala, but other countries as well, especially in the group of friends of indigenous peoples, who keep having an open dialogue with the UN agencies for indigenous peoples, but also within themselves. So if you see the delegation of these countries, you will see that we have a lot of representatives of indigenous peoples at the highest level of the government, such as Madam Minister, who is indigenous and works at the government. So it is a field of play where we have more opportunities to implement the Declaration. As for the 2030 agenda, as Madam the Minister has mentioned, in order to achieve the 2030 agenda objectives, it would be a mistake not to include indigenous peoples. Otherwise, we will have 370 million people left without a voice, and there cannot be development without 370 million people present. And as she said, we have to start with the benchmarks we have, because in order to know where we're going, we have to know where we're coming from. So having these quantitative indicators is important. We need indicators that are important as well for indigenous peoples. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Sure, thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the briefing. Gracias por la conferencia de prensa. I wanted to know, first, the new Secretary General has been in office now more than 100 days, and I just wanted to know, maybe from either the chair of the forum or from if you guys have had any interaction, what you think of his commitment and activity on these issues. And also tomorrow here in New York, there's going to be a protest of the shareholders meeting of Citibank about the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I wanted to know, it's sort of tied to this meeting or it's at least at the same time of this meeting. Are you aware of it? Do you think there'll be any participation of indigenous groups, beyond? There are definitely New York City groups heading to it at Cooper Union, but I wanted to know if you're aware of it and what you think more generally of this type of shareholder activism on things like the Dakota Access Pipeline. Thanks a lot.
En fait, la traduction n'a pas marché pour le français. Donc, est-ce qu'on pourrait...
Pensez-vous du secrétaire général? Ils sont compromis à ce thème.
Okay. Merci. Donc...
Thank you. So the new Secretary General before he got here, he took an oath for not to go back for where we came from. So not to have a regression on indigenous peoples. We talked to him. We actually sent him a letter on behalf of the three mechanisms of the indigenous peoples in order to have an ongoing dialogue with him. And we look forward to meeting him and working with him in order to have a higher dialogue with him and to keep this level. So this is something that will feed our future discussions and also for the special event. Thank you.
And Charles, Baltic Review.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, as was said earlier about the incoming Secretary General, I had occasion to meet with the outgoing former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in our territory, and one of the strong points we agreed to was with regard to the 2030 agenda, that we cannot, either us as indigenous leaders or state leaders, allow any opportunity for indigenous peoples to be left out. He said, make sure that indigenous peoples are included in every step of the way in terms of the 2030 agenda, because we know from experience in the Millennium Development Goals, we were left out again. And it wasn't until the Permanent Forum itself put on its agenda of an annual session the Millennium Development Goals so that we could actually review and comment on them. And so we should learn from that experience of exclusion and not repeat it going forward on the 2030 goals. As to the protest, I'm not aware of it actually, and it's first that I'm hearing of it today. However, I think that any time that a corporation, especially through its shareholders, takes a stand on an issue, it has to be a very important issue. And it's a very important opportunity for shareholders to express their voice at a corporate level to support, for example, the pipeline issue at the Dakotas. So I know that, for example, it's very difficult to have a protest at the UN. So it's obvious that they're not only very serious, but they're accomplishing an important step in bringing up an issue that's very close to many of indigenous peoples with regard to resource development, in the sense that surely to goodness in this day and age, we should not be desecrating sacred sites through corporate activity anymore. We should be respecting spiritual locations and beliefs of indigenous peoples like all other peoples. So although I'm not aware of it, I think it's an important opportunity that shareholders in the corporation are exercising to support an Indigenous cause in a good way.
So, please, Madam.
Yes. And Charles Baltic Review. This question is for Chief Willie, Littlechild, and the Chair. In realizing the rights of Indigenous people during the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Indigenous Peoples, do you expect the rights of Indigenous Crimean Tatars in Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation to be represented at the 16th session, or will they be blocked?
I don't know from where I'm coming from whether or not they'll be here to participate, but generally, from a different aspect, I would say that I've had discussions with representatives of the Crimean Tatar myself previously, again on a different matter, but still. As a matter of fact, I think they're having a side event right now as we speak here at the UN. So whether or not they'll be blocked or not, I don't know. I can't answer that, but I'm sure there'll be. There has always been representation for them here at the Permanent Forum in a good way, in a positive way, and as well in Geneva. So I'm not sure where the idea of them being blocked is coming from, and I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
Thank you for your question. I would just like to clarify it. Do you mean that the representative of the Crimean Tatars any statements that will be blocked in the report of the 16th session, or is it just to have access to this session?
If you are asking about the indigenous group being in the room or wherever they say it's included in the declaration.
Well, I know from past meetings, they definitely were blocked from participation. They would not let them participate in the Indigenous Peoples Forum. So that's why I'm asking now. And before they had the other person, the chairperson from a previous Indigenous Peoples meeting, said that this was true, that they could not participate. They wouldn't even let them at the forum. And then there have been other circumstances where I know that they have been here.
Alors,
So unfortunately, I have no further information on this issue. I actually couldn't see the list of all participants. We have over 1,000 participants at this 16th session. So as chair, I haven't had the opportunity to see the geographical representation of Indigenous peoples. However, we could meet to discuss about this issue. I am open for this. And as for the work deliberations, well, they will depend on the consensus, because everything that comes out of our report and decision making has to go through a consensus of all the 15 members of the Permanent Forum, and also it has to be adopted by the ECOSOC in July. So that's a second step to publish the recommendations that were adopted during the Permanent Forum. Thank you.
Let's take one last question. Yes. No, I think your light is not on. Now it's on.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, no? Hello. Jenny Monet, Indian Country Today. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to return to the issue of Standing Rock and to look at that as a high-profile case for the Indigenous rights struggle overall, and whether or not you feel that further amplifies the cause and the advocacy for Indigenous peoples and struggles across the globe.
Yes, it does. I think amplify the issue for Indigenous peoples across the globe. I had the honor, actually, of introducing Chairman Archambault in Geneva to address the Human Rights Council, and also had an opportunity to organize 3 special rapporteurs to meet with him to explain and hear from him the issue that was gaining and getting global attention. And because he was able to speak for himself in his own language and also a borrowed language to the UN, just the fact that he was able to address the UN exposed the situation globally. But this issue is not unique to Standing Rock. I think it applies, if I dare say, globally to Indigenous peoples. The area of natural resource ownership, if I could. By the way, the question of natural resource ownership was addressed in a United Nations study before by the late Irene Erica Diaz as a special rapporteur on the permanent sovereignty of Indigenous peoples over natural resources. So she canvassed that area very, very diligently. And in that study, one of the conclusions that she made was this was a global issue. The question of natural resource jurisdiction and ownership. But also, unfortunately, because there's no mechanism in place internationally on protection of sacred sites of Indigenous peoples, that's currently just being talked about now. I think corporations at will may have thought, well, it's okay to bulldoze a sacred site. It's okay to desecrate spiritual area. It's okay to contaminate water. It's okay to pollute it. So, but not anymore. I think the Standing Rock tribe standing up for their, Mother Nature, Mother Earth, in the way that they did, yes, attracted global attention, but also it spoke for a lot of other Indigenous areas, Indigenous territories, and Indigenous peoples who have been facing and are facing similar issues. So it is a very important and a bold move that they made, and commend them for protecting Mother Earth the way they did.
In fact, the challenges that have been mentioned, as we have mentioned, continue to be major in this sense. We had mentioned the importance of having the declaration on one side, but then also its inclusion in the different processes that each country carries forth. In this sense, I shall again mention the importance of strategic alliances amongst many sectors and stakeholders so that united we might make the declaration a reality. There have been advances, undoubtedly. However, for instance, in Guatemala, which is a country that is mostly indigenous, over 62% of the population, this creates a major challenge for us that the agenda for indigenous peoples, which is contemplated within a declaration, might be included and also contemplated within the laws and policies, especially within the governmental priority. It is also important to mention that the highest authorities of the UN must support us in a more opportune, more timely way in the recommendations that are created year after year. The chairs challenges are major in terms of pursuing substantial and significant advances as to the issues at hand. However, she can't do it alone. She will need the support of each and every one of us, of those of us that in one way or another have left a legacy and that have had a solid experience and important significant contributions in terms of the indigenous peoples, and that together we pursue that mechanism that will allow us to expedite processes that are important in pursuit of a better world, of a better area, because indigenous peoples are in expectation of us that in one way or another have achieved greater participation levels, that the majority of people whom we represent, that might receive that timely result. We have the Agenda 2030, we have the declaration, documents that have been ratified by each one of our countries. However, my main message is that we should all contribute in order to work for those that still lack representation, for those that still don't have these participation spaces such as what we have right now.
Merci.
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Chief Littlechild and Madam Minister, for your answers. Unfortunately, as indigenous peoples, we are cursed with our natural resources because due to our natural resources, we have no longer the right to live in peace in our land. What happened in Standing Rock is a precedent, is a benchmark for indigenous peoples all over the world, because it speaks of all the situations, not only for Standing Rock, but all over the world where indigenous peoples are facing the same issue at a different level, maybe not at the same level, but that is what we face as indigenous peoples. We do have the right to free, prior, and informed consent, as it is guaranteed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in Article 25, that states that indigenous peoples have the rights to land, territory, and resources that they use or that have used traditionally. So I truly support this protest. That is a good example. That is how indigenous peoples should oppose to the occupation of their land.
Madame Aboubakrine.
Thank you very much.
Littlechild, muchas gracias, señora ministra. I hope you have a great 2 weeks ahead of you. Good work in the Permanent Forum, and from the PI we will be, as usual, at your service for anything you might need. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this afternoon.